The rope snaps, the bucket jerks, slaps the stone, and the sealed wooden lid rises from the black water, rocking as if breathing. She's bleeding from one palm, lamp trembling, eyes fixed on a rusted lock and a cloth-wrapped bundle trapped beneath a crossbeam. She has 30 seconds to choose. Pull it up or let history sink. Her name is Archivist Girl, quiet librarian, new owner of a weathered cottage on the town's oldest road. The rumor followed the deed. A wishing well capped before the flood that erased a neighborhood and most of its records. To understand the pull of that rope, we need to go back. She moved in on a weekday when the wind kept the trees whispering, the kind of day you tell yourself means a fresh start. The cottage was small, 2 rooms deep, wrapped in clapboard and ivy. Inside, everything sounded bigger than it was. The front door sighed, the stove clicked, the floorboards spoke in different tones when she walked them, like the building had a quiet language. On her second trip from the car, a board near the hallway protested with a sharp squeak. She pressed it again. The sound changed. Under her weight, the plank lifted just enough to reveal a gap. She knelt, slowly, carefully, and found a brittle fragment of paper tucked into the dust. The edges curled like burnt leaves. In the center, one word in trembling pencil, well, a small circle, an arrow pointing toward the back of the house. She held the fragment to the window light. The fibers glowed, and for a heartbeat the cottage felt like it breathed with her. She should have laughed at it. Houses collect rumors and scraps. But she didn't. She was a librarian. She trusted paper. Paper remembers what people try to forget. That night, she didn't sleep. Rest had been hard to come by lately. An estrangement had opened a quiet wound that hummed under everything. Conversations, dinners, drives. Silence followed her like weather. She'd hoped the cottage out on the ridge might help. The wind did help. The owls helped. The quiet didn't. By morning, the fragment felt less like a discovery and more like a request. She set her coffee on the sill and spread the deed, the survey, and a photocopy of an old plat map across the kitchen table. The deed had one peculiar line. Easement, municipal water, 1901. It didn't fit a cottage that small, but the plat offered a hint. Faint circles dotting the ridge, each with a letter number code. One near her boundary line. She took out tracing paper and began to layer the old over the new. The habit calmed her. Slow lines, careful corners, edges clicking into place when they wanted to. Slowly, a circle formed where her back lawn rolled down into scrub, a rough ring that might have been a planter, a former fire pit. Nothing, or exactly what the fragment insisted. To understand why any of this mattered, you need the town's lore. In 1936, rain took aim at the valley and didn't stop. The river rose, wrestled, its banks, and broke through the mill road. Neighborhoods near the low streets drowned in silt. Officials capped wells and marked off contaminated ground. People relocated. Papers didn't. Boxes in basements swelled and split. By the time the water fell back into the riverbed, maps had changed and stories traveled without luggage. At the library, she'd spent years handling books that carried that flood in their grain. The slight wave in the pages, the sour smell where ink once bled. Patrons still brought pieced-together tales of houses moved on skids, trunks lost, neighbors gone. The wishing well was one of those stories, tossed between families. Children had dropped pennies and prayers into it, someone said. Then the city capped it and told people to forget. People did, mostly. She couldn't. The fragment, well, sat on her desk like a fingertip pressed to glass. Out back, after a day of steady rain, the lawn held shadows in unexpected places. She walked the perimeter. Her boot found a softer circle the mower had ignored. The grass dipped. Her heel tapped something hard that wasn't rock. She pressed the toe of her boot in a slow arc and felt edges. Bricks. Buried, tight as a lid. She fetched a hand trowel, then a flat spade, scraping carefully until a ring appeared. Brick laid on brick, mortared and then buried. Along one edge, a metal tag slept in the soil, stamped with 2 characters, D12. She brushed it clean. The code felt like a key cut for a door that no longer had a house. The municipal office had answers until you asked a real question. She brought the tag, asked for well logs, and watched a clerk scroll and shrug. "Basement flood took our early records," he said, almost apologetic. "Honestly, if there's a cap, just leave it. Liability." He wrote down a statute number, slid it across the counter like a coaster. Meanwhile, at the archive, she put on gloves and requested town ledgers that hadn't been touched in years. The bindings groaned. Pages stuck where water once made strangers meet. She turned each sheet with a patience learned from decades of paper. Lift, wait for the whisper, settle. Between tax rolls and street improvements, someone had slipped a note. "Keep singing, the water will return." No signature. Dated the week before the big flood. An elderly patron saw the open ledgers and paused. "You know," she said, "when the pipes ran dry, a choir sang at a well up on the ridge. Not for wishes, for courage." The woman's eyes went far away, like she could still hear it. Back at the cottage, the wind played the eaves like a low instrument. The easement line on the deed looked bolder now. She walked to the ring again at dusk, set a palm to brick chilled by evening, and felt that same quiet request. Don't look away. If the well was real, it could hold the kind of evidence that puts names back on maps. Who lived here, who left, who didn't get the chance. But there was one problem. The well wasn't just lost, it was sealed against memory. Morning after rain, the yard felt newly spelled. Water beaded on blades, and the low ground held a darker green. She walked the line she'd traced on paper, measuring with steps she'd already counted in her head. Near the dip, the grass thinned in a perfect arc. Her boot landed, heel first, and tapped the hidden ring. The sound wasn't stone. It had that hollow, made-thing tone that makes people tilt their heads. She knelt with her trowel and worked inward. Small cuts, gentle pressure. The soil gave up pebbles and roots. Then the shape sharpened. Bricks nested in a circle, mortar pale as old bone. She brushed away the loam and found a seam. At the north edge, something metal winked. She pried it free with a fingertip and turned it toward light. A lead tag, the size of a coin, stamped D12. The impression was crude but deliberate. Not a backyard project. This was a mark meant to outlast the person who pressed it. She fetched a stiff brush and a bucket, unwilling to dig fast. Each pass revealed more of the cap. Mortar smoothed over the central hole, a thin ridge where a lid might once have turned. When she pressed her palm to the brick, it felt cool but not dead. Wind lifted the hair at her neck. She tried the seam with a flat bar. It didn't budge. That told her 2 things. Whoever sealed this wanted it to stay sealed, and it hadn't been disturbed in a very long time. While the ground remained, the map in her head kept unfolding. D12 matched the ghosted code she'd seen on the plat. It was a system, a grid of wells, each with a letter and number. Infrastructure. not rumor. Somewhere, there had been a ledger linking code to location and purpose. If that ledger survived, it would tell stories the flood tried to erase. She took the tag to City Hall, the place where paper should answer. Inside, fluorescent light washed the color off everything. She set the tag at the counter and asked for well logs, maintenance orders, anything for municipal water around 1901. The clerk, kind eyes, tired shoulders, typed, then frowned. Anything pre-40s, if it existed, it likely drowned when our basement took on water, he said. We rebuilt the files, but gaps. He lowered his voice. If you found a cap, best leave it. There's an ordinance. Fines for tampering. He slid a photocopied statute toward her with that practiced, helpless shrug of the public worker who's seen too many good questions land against the wrong wall. She folded the copy, thanked him, and walked out into sun that suddenly felt like a dare. Legal risk wasn't abstract for her. She'd seen what bureaucracy could do when it felt embarrassed. Quiet pressure, long emails, the word liability repeated like a closing hymn. But the tag pressed into her pocket where her hand kept finding it. The law's purpose was safety. The well's purpose had been life. Who gets to decide what history stays? Buried? Meanwhile, the archive offered a different kind of answer. She logged in as staff and requested ledgers pulled from the secure stacks. They arrived on a cart. Water-warped spines, cotton tape repairs, penciled notes still legible in the margins. She eased open a volume labeled Waterworks Assessments, 1898-191. Pages whispered. Columns listed addresses, diameters, materials, scores of lines of work, days long gone. In the back, a page where a hand had drawn small circles with letter number pairs and arrows toward property lines. D12, with a faint cross by it. Beside it, in tiny script, Ridge Relief. She ran a finger beneath the words. Relief wasn't technical, it was human. Relief meant thirst answered, the boiling done, the bucket filled. Her breath slowed, the image sharpened. Neighbors at the ring, voices during a dry summer, someone organizing a schedule, not wishing, survival. An elderly patron drifted close, pulled by the sight of old paper like birds pulled toward water. You're back in the wells, she said softly. My mother said when the pipes went sour, they sang at the ridge. The song wasn't for magic. It was to keep pace while they waited. She smiled without showing teeth. Voices hold a line better than rope. That detail folded itself into her. A choir at a well. The note she'd found. Keep singing. The water will return. Across town in the municipal ledger, Ridge Relief. Meanwhile, in her yard, mortar sealed like a memory that didn't trust time. Back home, she chalked a hairline circle across the cap, marking quadrants, noting a hairline crack near the eastern edge. She set a tripod over the ring, not to pull, not yet, but to measure. She lowered a weighted line through a tiny vent fissure she'd opened with a needle file, just enough to test air. Cold rose. The line tapped wood at a depth that matched the brick thickness, and then kept going. Below wood, the faint slosh of water. Her face warmed. This wasn't a simple fill. It was intact. Intact meant possible contents, and possible contents meant names. The ordinance sat on her kitchen table like an argument she didn't want to have yet. She read it twice. The words were dry, the fines weren't. But while the city stalled, the ground kept speaking. At night, when she turned off the lamp, she could hear a small echo under the floor, the way old houses sometimes carry sound through joists. It wasn't the well, she told herself. It was her attention turning into noise. She made a list. Request the 1901 council minutes. Search newspaper clippings for relief well. Interview anyone who remembered songs. She added one more line and circled it. Ask permission. From whom? The families who once drew water there, if any had stayed. The ground doesn't grant it. People do. She called a neighbor whose fence met her back line, a man who'd lived on the ridge all his life. He listened, then said, "My grandmother talked about a key they tied with blue thread during the dry years. Key to a chest, maybe. Said the choir kept it safe at the well. Something about names." He paused. "You're careful. If you're going to touch that ring, don't do it alone." That night, clouds bunched and passed. She stood at the circle with a headlamp off and let her eyes adjust. The bricks held a low sheen where the day's damp hadn't burned off. Below she could feel space. Above, her lungs didn't quite fill. Fear and pull braided. There was a complication she couldn't ignore. The ordinance didn't just threaten fines. It warned about contaminated groundwater and collapse. The stakes weren't theoretical. Rope can slip. Stone can fracture. A hand can get caught. But there was also a promise in those ledgers and voices. If the well held a ledger or a token, it might restore a map, give families back their coordinates. It might let a town tell a more honest story about who stayed, who left, who was lost. She measured again, chalked again, then packed her tools. No cap would move tonight. But the decision was gathering weight. While the city delayed, the ridge remembered, and the circle in the grass waited, patient as a held breath. To understand why the circle wouldn't let her go, we need to go back to the paper. She started where she always did, with clippings that smelled faintly of iron and old glue. The library's vertical files held envelopes labeled in 3 hands across 4 decades. Flood, waterworks, relocation. She set them in a row and began to read. Newsprint offered a blunt timeline. Days of rain, broken mains, temporary closures, a terse notice that certain wells on the ridge were secured for public safety. A later column mentioned community song gatherings to steady morale. No dates, no names, just a paragraph that felt like a window into someone else's kitchen. It wasn't enough. She pivoted to the survey notes, thin onion skin sheets with grid lines and pencil ruling, the kind of paper that sighs when you lay it flat. The notes from 1901 showed alignments of pipe and grade, and at the edge of the ridge, a faint circle scratched in and labeled D12, then erased, then rewritten. In the margin, a tiny arrow pointed toward a box, access via ring. The handwriting was tight, careful, like a person who knew their work would have to speak for them later. Meanwhile, in special collections, a pastor's diary had been catalogued as Local Life, 193-37. She asked for it. The cover was plain cloth, edges frayed to threads. Inside, the script was patient and tidy. Notes on births, funerals, weather. Then a small drawing, a ring of stones, a plank set like a lid, a cross-hatched circle for water. Below it, one line. We meet at the ridge well when the pipes go dry. We sing to pace the waiting. A date a week before the river took the mill road. That drawing marked a turn. The well wasn't just infrastructure. It was a place where people gathered when everything else failed. Choir practice in silence, but with purpose. She copied the page number and closed the diary with both hands, as if it were a fragile door. Back upstairs, a box from an old donation sat in a gray stack labeled Audio, Unsorted. She scanned the finding aid and froze on a single line. Cassette, River Choir, Last Rehearsal. She requested it, half expecting the tape to be blank. The cassette came in a cracked case with masking tape on the spine, and 4 letters written in marker, faded to the color of tea. She carried a small player out to the reference desk, plugged in headphones, and pressed play. The room filled her ears with hiss, then laughter, then voices finding a note the way hands find a rough wall. An alto counted softly, and the first chord drifted in, tender, unadorned, a lullaby's shape. They sang of a river being tired and people holding it until it slept. No soloists, no show. Just harmony like a hand laid on a shoulder. The sound reached a place in her chest that had been stiff for months. She used to sing. She'd stopped after the fallout that cut her life in two, and the absence had hardened into habit. Listening now, she felt that habit loosen just a little. What nobody knew at the time was that a set of nitrate negatives, boxed under photos, weather events, held a ghost that mattered. She pulled the envelope by its call number and took it to the light table. The film smelled faintly of vinegar and danger. She slipped on gloves and spread the strip. Frame 1, water over the mill road. Frame 2, men with shovels by a culvert. Frame 3, a ring of stone, a crowd, someone pouring water over a child's head. At the edge, the emulsion had burned away in scalloped waves, but the center held. A signboard, hand-painted, D12. In the corner, small dark shapes tied at the wrist of the front row singers. Ribbons, maybe. Threads. She leaned closer. A sash draped over a shoulder had a narrow line of dark down its edge, hand-dyed or faded. Not much to go on, unless you'd grown up seeing scraps of color and asking where they came from. The neighbor's words returned. Blue thread, a key at the well. She felt the click that happens when two pieces of evidence sit down together. Meanwhile, catalog cards offered a minor miracle. In Storage B, Drawer 4, someone years ago had labeled a series, Choir Materials, Ridge. Most drawers hold emptiness at the end of their title. This one held a small roll of staff paper, browned at the edges, with a melody line and the title Lullaby for Water. In the corner, penciled initials matched a name from the pastor's diary. In the margin, Sing Until the Bucket Rises. She tried the melody under her breath. It sat comfortably in a mid-range, meant for ordinary voices, the kind you don't notice until you realize you've been breathing with them. She sang the first 2 bars quietly and felt her own voice crack, across the break, then steady. Healing isn't loud, it's patient. All of this would mean nothing if it stayed in boxes. The point wasn't to prove she could find things. It was to help names find their way home. She made a list of every family mentioned in the choir notes and cross-checked them against city directories from 1936 and 1937. Half reappeared on higher ground. Too many didn't. The words stayed, refused, missing appeared in pencil beside the list in the pastor's pages. It was the kind of record communities don't trust themselves to keep unless they're afraid no one else will. She set the negatives back in their envelope, rewound the cassette, returned the diary to its cradle. On her desk, she lined up the fragments, D12 on the plat, ridge relief in the ledger, the choir's tape, the drawing, the burned frame with a baptism, the note about blue thread. Each piece alone was a curiosity. Together, they formed a voice. The well was a meeting place for courage. It held water, and it held a pattern. When the world broke, people gathered, named what was lost, and sang. Knowing changed nothing, unless she could find the well's voice again. She looked out the window toward the ridge. The wind had picked up, turning the trees into a slow wave. The tape's final chord still warmed her ears. She packed the diary transcription, the printed clippings, and the map overlays into a folder. The circle in the grass was waiting, but now it wasn't just a circle. It was a threshold. Evening came with air cool enough to make breath visible. She chose this hour on purpose. Quiet, forgiving light. Neighbors home from work. No one in a hurry. She'd knocked on one door that afternoon. The man who met her at the fence listened, then nodded. He brought work gloves, a coil of rope, and the kind of calm that comes from knowing a place longer than most maps have. My grandmother called it the Ridge Ring, he said. If we're opening anything, we do it slow. They walked to the circle together. The tripod stood where she'd left it, legs set wide, pulley oiled, the line coiled like a sleeping snake. She laid tools out on a blanket, cold chisels, a mason's hammer, a small pry bar, a hand winch they'd borrowed from his shed. She'd already drawn protective chalk lines and slipped a measuring tape into the seam to confirm the cap's thickness. No guesswork now. Only patience. He knelt and touched the mortar. This wasn't slapped on, he murmured. Someone cared how this sat. He tapped once with his knuckles and listened for resonance. Then he looked at her. You sure? She was. Not in a loud way, but in the way you feel when a line of notes lands where it should. We open what we can. We stop if anything shifts, she said. We don't break what we can't fix, and we do it together. He smiled at that. Then they got to work. She set the cold chisel at the hairline crack she'd mapped, angled, to lift mortar without shattering brick. The first strike rang through her wrists. Dust rose in a thin ribbon. He followed with steady taps that widened the seam. They worked in a rhythm that kept them careful. Tap, lift, brush, breathe. When a flake loosened, she caught it and set it aside as if it were a page. The ridge held its breath. An hour in, the seam opened enough to show wood beneath. A lid, swollen and gray. The neighbor threaded the rope over the pulley and tied a bowline around a crossbar they eased into the gap. They added a second line as backup, checked knots, checked again. Slow, he said. She nodded. They cranked the hand winch. The lid moaned like a door eased after a long winter, then pivoted a hand's breadth. Cold air rose. Mineral, clean, a hint of iron. She felt it graze her face and thought of the note in the ledger. Keep singing. The water will return. Hold, he said. He braced the crossbar. She slid a wedge to keep the lid from slipping back. Then, together, they drew it further. The dark opened. The headlamp on her forehead cast a narrow cone. It met stone, then shadow, then the shine of water. On the left, iron rungs descended into the shaft. On the right, an old crossbeam, rusted but stubborn, angled across the mouth. Smell that? He asked softly. Not stagnant, that's good. He leaned carefully and trained his light along the waterline. Something sat there, just below the surface, wood darker than the lid, and the suggestion of cloth wrapped tight. A bundle. The neighbor drew in a breath. You seeing it? She was. Her pulse answered. They rigged a bucket with a secondary line, tied onto the winch, and tested the give. She eased the bucket past the crossbeam, guiding with a gloved hand while he kept tension. The rope hummed against the pulley. When the bucket met the water, she felt the weight change. She nudged, coaxed, tried to hook the bundle. The edge caught on something and slipped. The neighbor steadied the line. Let it breathe, he said. Don't rush. She tried again, lower this time, then drew up. Steady, steady. The bundle slid to the bucket lip and balanced there, wavering. There was a sound like a throat clearing, then a crunch. The crossbeam sank a fraction, rust gone from wanting to be metal to wanting to be memory. The rope jerked, the bucket slammed the stone and jumped. The line burned through her glove, sliced her palm, bright pain zapping her forearm. The bundle seesawed and slipped into the dark. Her heart dropped with it. She clenched, uselessly, at air. "Hand," the neighbor said. "Let me see." She set her palm open. Blood welled. He tore a strip from a shop rag, wrapped it tight, and looked her in the eyes until her breath matched his. "We're okay," he said. "But the beam's done." She swallowed, nodded, then turned the headlamp back to the well. The bundle hadn't vanished. A corner of cloth had snagged on a lower iron rung, a shadow figure holding its breath. "There," she whispered. He saw it too. "We can't use the bucket," he said. "It'll knock it loose. You got a smaller line?" She did, a thin cord coiled with her chalk. She tied a slip loop, knotted for grip, and lowered it hand over hand, her bandaged palm throbbing. The neighbor lay flat, arm threaded through the crossbar, guiding the loop. "Left," he said. "Now, close." She tightened. The loop cinched the cloth. It held. They lifted, not with the winch, but with backs and breath. The rig groaned, but didn't fail. The cloth rose, water sheeting off it in small curtains. He steadied the weight. She kept the angle true. Inch by inch, the bundle cleared the lip and settled onto brick. She exhaled a laugh that sounded like crying. He sat back on his heels. "You all right?" She nodded. Blood had bled through the rag in a crescent, but it slowed. She set both hands, one careful, on the cloth. It was heavy for its size, damp but intact. She unwound the fabric, layers stuck the way pages stick after a spill. Inside, a tin lay cradled in wax seal, the surface dulled to a soft gray. Next to it, folded paper, edges waved from damp, and a small brass key tied with a narrow thread, the color of river at twilight. She lifted the key. The thread was old, but still blue. The neighbor saw it and made a small sound. "She wasn't making it up," he said. "My grandmother and her thread." She held the tin to her ear. No rattle. Heavy. The folded list on top bore a title in pencil that time hadn't erased. Households, Ridge. Below it, a column of names, each with a single word beside. Stayed, refused, missing. The beam groaned again. They both looked at the seam as if it had spoken. He gestured toward the blanket. "Let's get this inside." She nodded. They eased the lid back into place, set wedges, marked the beam with chalk for a brace to add tomorrow. Then they carried the tin, the list, and the key across the yard like a relay of breath. Inside, under lamplight, the blue thread caught and held. The list wasn't just paper. It was a door the flood had closed and the ridge had kept. And now it had opened. She let the paper breathe before she read. Lamplight softened the waves in the pages, and the blue thread lay across her wrist like a reminder to go gently. The title, Households, Ridge, held steady. The margins wavered. Beside each family name sat a single word in pencil. Stayed, refused, missing. No flourish, no explanation. Just verdicts written small enough to carry in a pocket. Stakes announced themselves without speeches. These names weren't just entries. They were coordinates that once fixed people to a place. If half never reappeared after the flood, then whatever lived inside this list mattered to living people now. She took a breath and began. She copied the names onto fresh paper and built 2 columns. List on the left, where each word sat. City directory on the right, where, if the town had done its job, those people should have returned to ink after 1936. She pulled the directories from a shelf she knew by heart and laid them open with their spines supported, then moved line by line. The pencil beside her tapped a quiet, steady beat. Some reappeared in small apartments on higher streets. New addresses, same first names, small mercies. Others turned to silence. She cross-referenced the cemetery logs, another ledger that smelled like damp and winter, and found stones for a few whose entries said, refused. Refused what? Evacuation orders? Forced relocation? Trust? The word missing kept its shape, though. It gave nothing back. Meanwhile, tax rolls offered a different kind of absence. Parcels marked transferred to city, owners unknown. She traced those parcels up the ridge and felt the map thicken in her hands. A pattern emerged. Those closest to the well had notes, short and human. Child sick. Moved with sister. No answer. Not official language. Choir language. Someone wrote as if they knew each door. She needed a voice from the list to move this work off paper and into air. The neighbor gave her a name for the last surviving daughter from one of the families marked stayed. She called, introduced herself plainly, and asked for permission to visit with care. A pause, then a yes that sounded like a hand opening. They sat outside on a porch that had been painted many times. The afternoon light made slow patterns through leaves. The daughter's hands rested on a folded towel. The towel rested on a lap shaped by years of sitting with stories. Archivist girl set the blue-threaded key on the table between them. The older woman blinked, then smiled, this time with teeth. I wondered who would find that, she said. They tied it to the sash so it wouldn't wander. They talked the way people do when the subject is heavy and the air is kind. The daughter remembered the ring as a place of waiting and counting, remembered her mother's voice choosing the low line when the high notes felt like too much. We didn't wish, she said. We measured our patience. She touched the edge of the list and traced her family's name. We stayed because we didn't know where to take our dead, she added quietly. Moving made no sense until we could carry them with us. On the walk back to the car, the stakes settled deeper. Recognition isn't a headline. It's a promise to hold people as carefully as paper is held, and to accept that some lines must remain closed when families ask. Parallel to those porch conversations, Town Hall offered a colder room. She carried the list in protective sleeves and the tin in a padded case, asked for a short audience with the council, and laid out the facts. Faces watched, some interested, some guarded. A counselor cleared his throat and said what institutions say when they feel the weight of the past land on their ledger. Now, recognition implies responsibility. Memorials cost money. Liability aside, we'd need to verify. She nodded. Verification was her language. But the talk radio echo chamber spun faster than process. A rumor bloomed that she'd staged a stunt, planted a well, faked a list, chased attention. She didn't answer on air, she worked. Back at the archive, she tested the brass key against a small wooden chest that had been catalogued decades ago as MISC, Ridge Items, Provenance Unknown. The lock turned with a polite click, the way a door opens when it's relieved to stop pretending. Inside sat songbooks bound in twine, a felt pouch of pins for choir sashes, and a folded paper that matched the hand in the pastor's diary. Inventory could wait. The point now was the thread. She lifted a pin. Its ribbon, faded slate, caught light and looked in that moment exactly like the color on the key. She laid the damaged choir photo beside it, and the pattern snapped into place. The blue thread wasn't decoration. It was a sign you could trust the hand that carried the key. The people at the well had designed their own chain of custody. Their memory practice was more rigorous than the city's. She returned to the names and the map. The list split into constellations. The households who kept meeting at the ring. The ones who refused official orders but accepted neighbors' help. The ones who vanished into the current of rumor and grief. She wrote letters to descendants when she could locate them, not demanding artifacts, just offering what she'd found and asking what they wanted remembered. Some wrote back with dates, recipes, a hymn variant scribbled on an index card. One family replied with a clear boundary: no inclusion, no plaque, no reading. She said thank you and meant it. Trust costs what it costs. Meanwhile, pressure mounted in halls and on phones. If we name the lost, are we admitting the city failed? One voice asked. Another said, if we do this once, we'll have to do it again. The neighbor, tired of talk, placed his grandmother's spool of blue thread in her palm. Tie it where people can find it, he said. She understood. Not a monument set in stone, not yet. A path. The impact was already forming, quiet as moss. Students at the library heard pieces of the story and wanted to help. They offered scanners, time, careful hands. A local teacher sent notes from a class that had listened to the lullaby and wanted to learn the low line. The ridge, at last, was back on a map that mattered. Not just the one with streets, but the one with voices. What nobody knew at the time, the chest wouldn't be empty, and the key wouldn't just open wood. It would open a way of gathering that could hold both presence and privacy, both naming and grace. The list had given her a door. Now she had to decide how and with whom to walk through. She took the key back to the archive basement, where the air stayed cool and the lights hummed as if time itself lived down there. The chest waited on a steel shelf, mislabeled and patient. She set it on a table, laid the blue thread across the lid like a blessing, and turned the brass in the lock. The click was soft and sure. The lid lifted as if it had been practicing for this moment. Inside, songbooks bound with twine, edges feathered, a small reel of tape nested in tissue, loose pages typed on a manual machine, letters shallow and uneven. She lifted the top sheet. Request for a memory service at the Ridge Well. Eve of forecasted flood. The names listed matched the list from the tin. Families who stayed, families who refused, and those who were missing but were named anyway, as if presence could be made by speaking. She placed the paper aside and reached for the songbooks. The first held the lullaby she'd found upstairs, this time with harmony lines penciled in by different hands. Notes bent slightly where someone pressed too hard, then softened. In the margins were simple stage directions. Low voices carry. Let children start the echo. Breathe between verses. Wait for the bucket. The music wasn't performance. It was a tool. She set the reel on a dusty player that still worked if you kept a steady touch. The tape caught, stuttered, then turned, and the room filled with a hush that wasn't silence. People settling their feet on stone. A cough, a count. Then the hymn rose, steady, almost practical, a lullaby for a river that had worked too long. The alto line held the floor. Tenors laid a floorboard above it. Sopranos waited, then braided in. The words asked nothing. They promised to keep time while the water decided. She closed her eyes and let the sound find her. Something inside unclenched, the way a fist relaxes after holding a rope too long. She sang a single note under her breath and felt it falter, then steady. She didn't need to be good. She needed to rejoin. Healing isn't loud. It's repetitions done at a human pace. She flipped the typed letter and found a second page. "We will read the names at the well so that the ridge knows itself," it said. "If the city forgets, the ridge will not." Below, a simple schedule. Fetch water, list households present, sing while the pulley turns, break for bread, sing while the bucket rises again. In the corner, a small sketch of the ring she knew by feel now. The impact of that letter was immediate. The well was a site of remembrance as much as resource. It anchored a practice more durable than a pipeline. She thought of counsels and fines and how fear shrinks a story, then held the thread between finger and thumb and felt steadier than she had in months. She carried the chest upstairs to the digitization room, where students had left a note offering help. She wrote, "Yes," carefully. Back at her desk, she traced the path forward. Names deserved air, but not the glare that erases. Families deserved choice. The lullaby could gather people who didn't agree yet. She could propose something modest. A ceremony at the well, read what consent allowed, restore the ledger to protective housing, sing the hymn as it was intended, without show, with patience. Still, she paused. What to share? What to keep? Whose grief belongs on a plaque? She walked to the window, watched the ridge darken, and decided not to answer alone. She'd meet with descendants, ask, listen, adjust. The key had opened more than wood. It had opened a way to ask for permission with her whole posture. That night, she carried the reel home. She set the player near the window and let the hymn drift into the kitchen. The cottage absorbed it, timbers settling the way old houses do when a storm changes direction. She hummed while wrapping her palm, while washing the dinner plate, while turning off lamps one by one. The wound on her hand looked smaller. The wound she'd been carrying sounded smaller. Morning brought emails from the council, measured, cautious, but also one note with a simple line. "If this is real, we want to help." She smiled, then opened the chest again. There was a small envelope under the songbooks. Inside, a list labeled Reading Order. The first name had a fold through it, as if someone pressed it harder than the rest. She set that page aside and imagined the circle of people it described. Neighbors storing courage for one another. She drafted her proposal. Lanterns at dusk. A circle marked with chalk. The lid braced. The ledger read for those who consented. The chest returned to its place in the library, with a copy for those who wanted to hold it. The hymn taught on the low line first. She wrote one sentence, then underlined it. "We will not claim what isn't ours to tell." Before sending anything, she walked out to the ring. The wedges held. The beam waited for a brace. She placed the blue thread where the brick met brick, tied a small knot the way the neighbor's grandmother might have. The air at the well felt like a held breath meeting a steady exhale. She spoke quietly into that space. "We'll read the names. We'll return what is yours. We'll sing while the water decides." And this is where the real discovery begins. Not an object, but a way back to each other. The plan looked simple on paper until it touched people. Privacy lives in the pauses between names, and she could feel those pauses waiting. She started with phone calls, not announcements. She introduced herself as a librarian, not a savior, and asked to meet where folks felt at ease. Porches, kitchens, church basements that smelled faintly of coffee and lemon oil. She carried the ledger copy, the letter about the memory service, and the promise that no name would be spoken without permission. Then she listened. One grandson wanted his family's staying read aloud. He said his grandfather's stubbornness finally had context. A granddaughter, voice wavering, asked that their missing be held in silence. Grief had grown around that word like a vine. and cutting it open would hurt more than it healed. She wrote "redact" with care and left the line blank on purpose. A few conversations were less tidy. One man said his father refused because the city men didn't respect their fence. He wanted that word changed. She didn't. She offered a footnote of explanation in the living archive. The story next to the word, not the word erased. He considered, then nodded. The thing is, people want truth, but they want it carried gently. Council meetings felt colder, but she took the same posture. She laid out a plan that asked very little from the city and gave much back. No plaque yet, just a bench by the ring and a living archive at the library where families could add memories over time. Students would digitize the tape and songbooks. A small grant would pay for sleeves, scanning, and a brace for the Wells beam. Council relented with conditions. She accepted the conditions and kept the thread. There was one refusal that mattered. A family with 2 names on the list said no to everything. No reading, no inclusion, no mention beyond a private note. She said thank you. Trust is the cost of accuracy, and accuracy is the price of trust. She placed a clean sheet in the binder with a thin blue ribbon across it and wrote, "Held by request?" Absence can be honest. Meanwhile, the neighbor arrived with a gift. His grandmother's spool of blue thread, nearly used up but still strong. "Tie it where people can find it," he said. She wound a length around the bench slats, then tucked the spool into a jar by the sign-in sheet at the library. People took a piece as they added a memory, a simple act that made their care visible. The living archive took shape in soft light. An old photo labeled only "Summer" found its street again. A recipe card for bread served at the well joined the hymn arrangement in a sleeve. Someone brought a dry pail with a crack running through it like a healed bone. Children drew the ring as a circle of hands. With each addition, the ceremony shrank away from spectacle and toward belonging. She adjusted her notes. Names would be read in the order found, with redactions honored. The chest would be opened in view, then closed and returned to protective housing. The hymn would start low, because low carries others. A small grant arrived, 2 pages, 3 signatures, enough for braces, benches, and clean copies. Students scheduled scanning shifts and treated the tape like a sleeping bird. The city signed off on temporary lanterns, no amplification, and a rope boundary to keep the cap safe. It was enough. And then the night arrived. Lanterns ringed the stones like small moons, steady and kind. The rope boundary held a respectful distance, and the bench waited with a length of blue thread tied where a hand could find it. Rain threatened in the west, then thought better of it. People took their places without being told where to stand. She greeted them quietly, the way a librarian greets a room before a story begins. Neighbors clustered in small groups. Students hovered near the digitized copies, careful and proud. The council stood off to the side, watchful but softer than they had been. A child balanced on tiptoes, both hands tucked into an adult's coat pocket. The well's lid sat braced, wedges set, the repaired beam marked and true. The circle felt held. A hush rose, not silence, but that shared pause before breath. She set the wax-sealed tin on a low table, then lifted the lid so everyone could see what had been kept, and returned. The folded list lay where they'd placed it days earlier, now housed in a clear sleeve that caught the lantern light like water. She touched the blue thread at her wrist, and began with what had brought them there. "We're here because a ring of brick remembered what paper almost forgot," she said. "We asked permission. Some said yes. Some asked for quiet. We will honor both." She looked up and let the words sit. The first micro-story arrived with a small voice. A child stepped forward, guided by a hand at their shoulder, and read two names that had permission to be spoken. The syllables left the child's mouth and crossed the air like a bridge. Someone near the back lifted a sleeve to an eye. You could hear a coat zipper, a throat cleared, the night being careful with every sound it allowed. The last surviving daughter, who'd traced a name with her finger on a porch table, stood next. She didn't speak. She walked to the wall of the ring and set her palm against the brick, as if completing a circuit that had been open for decades. Her shoulders loosened. She nodded once, then returned to her seat without looking for approval. The circle accepted the gesture like it had been waiting for it. The neighbor hummed before words found him. He touched the repaired beam lightly, then took his place beside her. When she lifted the small chest for all to see, she turned the brass key slowly, not to heighten drama, but to let people catch the moment. The lid opened. Songbooks, the felt pouch of pins, and the typed letter rested exactly as they had. She removed the letter and read the line that had anchored everything. "We will read the names at the well so that the ridge knows itself." Then she added the promise she'd made. "We will not claim what isn't ours to tell." She invited the town to keep building the living archive. A table stood ready with sleeves, pencils, and a jar of blue thread. "Take a piece if you add a piece," she said. "Tie it somewhere you want to remember." The hymn began without fanfare. She started the low line, steady and plain, then nodded to the neighbor to carry it with her. Others joined as they found their pitch. Some hummed more than sang, and it was enough. The melody folded the crowd into itself. You could hear the old arrangement breathing, in the way people took their time at the ends of phrases. Children wove the echo the margins had asked for. The circle of sound wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was complete. Meanwhile, a student quietly filmed on a tripod, capturing faces not for the internet first, but for the archive. An honest record for families who couldn't attend. The counselor who'd worried about implications closed their eyes and sang two lines under their breath, more present than political. The rain held at the border of the ridge, listening. She opened the tin again, then set the ledger into a protective case. "This goes back to the library," she said. "It will be scanned and handled, not owned. Add your memories. Ask for redaction if you need it. Absence can be honest." A murmur of relief moved through the crowd. Consent had a sound. Micro-stories kept surfacing. A man unfolded a recipe card and slid it into a sleeve beside the song. "My grandmother baked this for the break between verses," he said. A teenager brought a cracked pail, placed it on the ground, and rested a palm on the fracture. "We fixed what we could," she said. "We use it for flowers now." Small offerings, large meanings. When the hymn returned for a final verse, she didn't hold back. Her voice rose, cracked once, then landed. The neighbor's harmony steadied the place where she faltered, the way a hand on a shoulder steadies a stair. People held the last note like a lantern in wind, soft, imperfect, together. In that moment, the well shifted from curiosity to compass. It no longer asked for explanation. It offered direction. Remember slowly, speak carefully, keep each other while you wait. She felt the restlessness she'd brought to the ridge ease, not vanish but soften into something she could carry. The cottage behind her felt less like a place she'd escaped to, and more like a home she was returning from. Before the lanterns dimmed, she made one simple invitation. "If tonight gave you back a piece of your story, write to us," she said. "If you need part of it to remain yours, tell us that too." People nodded. A few pressed her hand in thanks. One person, quiet, slipped the spool of thread into the jar with a folded note. For the next gathering. Lantern by lantern, the ring settled into dark again. The bench kept its ribbon. The rope boundary stayed, not as a barrier, but as a promise to be careful with what had been opened. Footsteps softened toward the road. The ridge exhaled. In the quiet that followed, she stood at the edge of the stones and traced the chalk line with a fingertip. She didn't rush to pack the chest. She let the last vibration of the hymn fade into the brick. Then she lifted the case, turned toward the path, and walked the ledger home. The well didn't offer treasure. It returned names, a song, and a way to move forward without leaving anyone behind. If this story touched something in you, share the place that holds your town's memory in the comments. What keeps your community honest and whole? And subscribe for more quiet restorations of ordinary lives. If you're ready for another true story of remembrance, watch the next film.